Okay, picture this. You're standing in front of a city. Not ruins, not a foundation, not a few scattered stones with a sad little museum placard next to them. An actual city, massive walls, precision-cut stone blocks stacked so tightly you can't fit a sheet of paper between them. Streets, plazas, architecture that would be ambitious today with cranes and computers and a construction crew running on energy drinks and overtime pay. And the official explanation for how this place was built, we don't know. That's it. That's the whole answer. Some of the brightest archaeologists and historians on the planet have looked at this place, studied it for decades, run every test modern science has available, and the most honest thing they can say is, we genuinely have no idea how this happened. But here's the part that should stop you cold. The evidence suggests it didn't take centuries. It didn't take generations of labor passed down from father to son across hundreds of years. The geological and structural data points to something that appears to have happened in a window of time, so short it shouldn't be physically possible. We're talking about a city that, by every reasonable calculation, could not have been built as fast as the evidence suggests it was, and yet there it is. Most ancient mysteries follow a familiar pattern. You find something old, you argue about who built it, you eventually settle on some version of a lot of people working for a long, enormous organized labor force, decades of construction, probably took centuries of effort across multiple phases. Even the most awe-inspiring structures of the ancient world have explanations that, while complicated, fit inside the basic laws of what human beings can do with enough time and enough people. This city breaks that pattern completely, because the issue isn't just the scale, it's the timeline. And when you look at what the timeline actually implies, it stops being a historical curiosity and starts being something that deserves a much harder look than it usually gets. Here's what we're actually dealing with. The site contains stonework that required quarrying, transporting, and precisely fitting blocks that weigh anywhere from several tons to, in some cases, hundreds of tons. The cuts are not rough, they are not approximate. They are machined-level accurate, with angles and joints so exact that engineers who have visited the site have used words like impossible, and then immediately walk that back because scientists aren't supposed to say impossible, but you can see them thinking it. The blocks fit together in ways that distribute weight and resist seismic activity with an efficiency that modern structural engineers find genuinely difficult to replicate, even knowing the outcome they're trying to achieve. And the dating evidence, the layers of sediment, the weathering, patterns, the position relative to surrounding geological formations, all of it compresses the construction window into something that doesn't compute when you do the math on what would have been required. So, before we get into the theories, before we talk about what people have proposed and what the evidence actually supports, it's worth sitting with the raw strangeness of the situation for a moment. Because there's a version of this story that gets told as entertainment, as a fun mystery, something to fill an hour on a documentary channel between commercials. And there's another version that's quieter and more unsettling, which is that this place exists, it has been studied seriously, and the honest conclusion is that we are missing something fundamental. Not a small detail, not a footnote, something big. Something about what was possible in the ancient world that we have either forgotten or perhaps never understood in the first place. That's not a comfortable place to sit, but it's the accurate one. And it's where this story actually begins. Here's the thing about ancient mysteries. They attract a certain kind of explanation. And if you've spent any time reading about this place, you've already encountered all of them. The lost civilization with technology we can't comprehend. The ancient astronauts with their convenient laser cutters and anti-gravity devices. The secret knowledge of a priestly class that somehow evaporated without leaving a single written record. These theories have a seductive quality to them. They're clean, they're dramatic. They fill the gap with something that feels proportionate to the scale of what you're looking at. The problem is that almost none of them survive contact with the actual evidence, And the ones that do survive are the ones that are the least satisfying, because they don't fully explain anything either. So, let's go through them honestly, because that's the only way this is worth your time. Start with the most common explanation. Massive organized labor. Thousands of workers, military-style logistics, a centralized authority with the power to conscript entire populations and direct them toward a single monumental goal. This is how we explain the pyramids. This is how we explain the Great Walls and the aqueducts and most of the other things ancient humans built that still make us feel inadequate. And look, there's something to it here too. You don't build anything at this scale without organization, without hierarchy, without someone in charge of the stone and someone in charge of the food, and someone in charge of making sure the whole operation doesn't collapse into chaos by Tuesday. All of that is almost certainly true. The problem is the math. If you work backward from the number of blocks, the weight of those blocks, the distances they were transported, and the precision with which they were fitted, and then you divide all of that by any realistic estimate of available labor and working hours, you get a number that doesn't work. You get a construction pace that would require either a workforce so enormous it strains all credibility, or a timeline so compressed it raises the exact question we started with. More hands doesn't solve this. It just moves the problem around. Okay, what about lost technology? This is where things get genuinely interesting, and also where a lot of people go off the rails. The serious version of this argument isn't about aliens or magic. It's about the possibility that ancient civilizations developed technical capabilities, specific tools, specific methods, specific materials knowledge that were never written down, never transmitted, and simply disappeared when the civilization that held them collapsed or was destroyed. That's not a crazy idea. We know for a fact that Greek fire was so effective it terrified entire naval fleets, and Roman concrete was lost for over 1,000 years and only partially reconstructed through modern chemistry. So the concept of lost technical knowledge is real. The question is whether lost technology of the kind required here, something capable of cutting and moving and fitting stone at this level of precision and scale, could have existed and left absolutely zero trace beyond the work itself. And that's where the serious version of the argument starts to wobble. Tools leave marks, processes leave residue, knowledge leaves fragments even when civilizations fall. And here, the silence is almost total. Then there's the theory nobody wants to say out loud in a serious conversation, but that fills comment sections and documentary runtime in equal measure. Outside intervention, the ancient astronaut hypothesis in its various forms. And look, dismissing it entirely feels too easy, because the underlying question it's responding to is legitimate. How do you explain something that appears to exceed the known capabilities of the people who were supposedly there? That's a real question. But the answer, therefore aliens, is doing an enormous amount of work with an enormous amount of nothing. There is no physical evidence of non-human presence at this site or any comparable site. Not a tool, not a material, not a biological trace, not a single artifact that requires an off-world explanation. What the ancient astronaut theory actually tells us, if we're being honest, is less about the ancient world and more about our own assumptions. We look at this construction and say it's beyond human capability, but what we really mean is it's beyond what we currently understand about human capability at that time, and those are very different claims, which leaves us somewhere uncomfortable. The conventional explanation doesn't fully work. The alternative explanations range from speculative to unsupported, and the structure itself just sits there, indifferent to all of it, waiting for someone to come up with a better question. Let's talk about what the science actually says. Not the documentary version, not the version filtered through someone's predetermined conclusion, but what researchers who have spent careers at this site will tell you when they're being precise and careful and honest about the limits of what they know. Because the scientific picture here is genuinely fascinating, and it's also genuinely incomplete in ways that the field doesn't always advertise loudly. Start with the dating. Establishing when something was built in the ancient world is harder than most people realize. You can't carbon date stone. Carbon dating works on organic. So when archaeologists date a stone structure, they're almost always dating something found near it or incorporated into it. Ash from a fire pit, seeds trapped in a wall, organic material embedded in mortar. And that method works reasonably well, but it has a fundamental limitation. It tells you when those organic materials were deposited. It doesn't always tell you when the stones were placed. Those two things are usually close enough that it doesn't matter. At this site, there are researchers who argue they might not be the same event at all, that what's being dated and what was actually constructed could be separated by a time gap that changes everything about how we're reading the sequence of events. That argument remains contested. But the fact that it remains contested at all, that serious credentialed researchers are making it in peer-reviewed contexts, tells you something important about how unsettled the foundational timeline actually is. Then there's the quarrying evidence, or more precisely, the problem with it. For any large stone construction project, you expect to find a clear signature in the landscape. Quarry sites with obvious extraction marks. Transportation routes worn into the terrain by the movement of heavy loads over time. Staging areas where blocks were shaped and finished before final placement. At sites like the Egyptian pyramids, all of that exists. You can follow the supply chain. The logistics are legible in the ground. At this site, the picture is murkier. There are quarry sources that have been identified, and some of the transportation logic makes sense for certain blocks. But for the largest and most precisely fitted stones, the ones that present the greatest engineering challenge, the supply chain gets harder to read. The extraction marks don't match cleanly with the finished surfaces. Some of the most anomalous blocks appear to have been worked in ways that don't correspond to any tool technology confirmed at the site. And a small number of researchers, not a fringe minority but published academics working in archaeometry and materials analysis, have noted surface characteristics on certain stones that remain unexplained by conventional quarrying and dressing methods. Here is where the scientific picture gets genuinely strange, and this is the part that tends to get buried under more dramatic claims on both sides. A team of materials scientists conducting analysis on the stone composition at the site found something unexpected. Certain blocks, not all of them, but a specific subset concentrated in the most structurally complex sections, show a mineral alignment pattern that is inconsistent with natural quarried stone. Natural stone has a random crystalline structure reflecting how it formed geologically over millions of years. These particular blocks show an alignment that in laboratory contexts is associated with a casting or agglomeration process, meaning the material may have been mixed, poured, or compressed into shape rather than cut from existing rock. If that finding holds up under further scrutiny, and it remains genuinely contested, it would reframe the entire question. The mystery wouldn't be how did they move and cut stones this large and this precise. It would be how did they develop a geopolymer or synthetic stone technology at a point in history when that capability has no known precedent. A different question entirely, and in some ways an even harder one. Now, layer on top of all of this the seismic engineering. Structural analysts who have examined the site's architecture consistently note that the construction displays a sophisticated understanding of how to build for earthquake resistance. The interlocking of blocks, the slight inward lean of walls, the way weight is distributed across the foundations, these are not accidental features. They are design choices that reflect knowledge of seismic behavior. The region is geologically active. Whatever was built here was built to survive ground movement, and it has, across a time frame that makes that durability even more remarkable. The engineering knowledge embedded in this structure is real, and it is advanced. And it arrived, apparently, without the long iterative tradition of trial and error that we would normally expect to precede that level of sophistication. You don't usually get the advanced version first. You get generations of progressively better attempts leading up to it. Here, the advanced version appears almost without prologue, which is the detail that keeps serious researchers up at night more than any of the dramatic anomalies. What science has given us is a set of precise and honest observations that collectively resist a clean explanation. The timeline is contested. The supply chain is partially illegible. The surface characteristics of key stones are anomalous. The engineering knowledge is advanced beyond its apparent context. None of that proves anything exotic, but all of it together means the straightforward story has significant holes in it. And the next question, the one science hasn't answered yet, is what fills them. Here's what nobody tells you when they hand you a mystery like this one. The mystery itself is data. Not the answer, not a clue pointing neatly toward a solution, but data about us. About what we find unbearable about not knowing. About why a city that has been sitting in the ground for thousands of years, studied by generations of researchers, photographed and measured and analyzed down to the mineral composition of individual stones, still feels unfinished. Still feels like it's waiting for something. That feeling is worth paying attention to, because it tells you something real about the difference between information and understanding, and about how rarely we actually achieve the second one even when we think we have the first. We live in a moment that is genuinely unprecedented in terms of access to knowledge. You are carrying in your pocket a device that connects you to essentially the sum total of recorded human information. You can pull up a satellite image of this site right now. You can read the original excavation reports. You can find the materials science papers, the contested dating analyses, the structural engineering assessments. All of it is there, available, indexed, searchable. And yet, the mystery persists. Not because the information is hidden, but because information isn't the same thing as comprehension. We have more data on this city than its builders ever could have imagined anyone possessing, and we still cannot fully explain it. There is something quietly humbling about that if you let yourself feel it. The reason this particular mystery has staying power, the reason it keeps pulling people back across decades of research and centuries of speculation, is that it sits at the intersection of two things humans find deeply uncomfortable: incompleteness and implication. The incompleteness is obvious. We don't have the full picture. The timeline has holes. The supply chain has gaps. The engineering knowledge appears without adequate precedent. That's the surface discomfort, the itch that sends people toward theories, toward explanations, toward anything that closes the open loop. But the implication is subtler and more unsettling, because if this city exists the way the evidence suggests it exists, built at a pace and with a precision that our current models of ancient capability cannot fully account for, then something is wrong with our models. And wrong models don't just affect this site. They affect every assumption we've built on top of them about who ancient people were, what they were capable of, and how human civilization actually developed. That last part is the one that makes academics cautious and makes everyone else restless. Because the standard narrative of human progress is deeply comforting. We started simple, we got more complex, we accumulated knowledge and capability across time in a more or less continuous upward line, and here we are at the top of it, the most sophisticated humans who have ever lived, able to look back down the slope and understand the whole journey. That narrative is not just historically convenient. It's psychologically necessary for a lot of people. It tells us where we are and how we got here and why the present makes sense. A city that doesn't fit that narrative doesn't just create an archaeological puzzle. It creates an existential one. What else don't we know? What other chapters are missing? How confident should we actually be in the story we've been telling ourselves about ourselves? Those are not comfortable questions, but they are the right ones. And the most honest thing you can say at the end of all this, after the geology and the materials science and the engineering analysis and the contested timelines, is that this city is not finished telling us things. We have not extracted everything it has to offer. The researchers working there right now, with better tools and better methods than any previous generation has had, are still finding things that don't fit cleanly. Still publishing papers that open new questions faster than they close old ones. Still standing in front of those walls with that particular expression that mixes professional discipline with something that looks a lot like awe. And maybe that's the actual point. Not the answer, but the quality of the question. Because the civilizations that built places like this one, whoever they were, whatever they knew, whatever methods they used that we haven't recovered yet, they were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not the rough draft of us. They were people operating at a level of organizational and technical sophistication that we are still, thousands of years later, working to fully understand. And that realization, if you really let it land, changes something about how you move through the world. You start looking at old things differently, not as relics of a simpler time, but as evidence of a complexity we lost track of. You start holding your assumptions a little more loosely. You start treating the gaps in the record not as empty spaces, but as places where something real used to be, something we haven't found yet, something that might still be there waiting under the right question asked by the right person at the right moment. The city was built. We don't know how, and that not knowing, pursued seriously and honestly, might be the most important thing about it.